Okay, how many of you have used lean methodologies to build your product? What we have here now is an expert in that field.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tendayi. I'm an academic by profession. I teach at the University of Kent. The reason why I have the title, the minimum and the viable, is that I want to emphasize that both words are an important part of the definition of what an MVP is. It has to be minimum and it has to be viable. So the question is, what do those two things actually mean in practice? Now, in order for you to be able to actually practice this process of building products in a lean way, you have to embrace inside your heart and in your mind and in the way you do things, a few principles. To the extent that you believe these principles are true, you're then much more likely to apply this process. So the first thing is that it's not actually that hard and that difficult to set up a technology startup. So the question is actually no longer whether something can be built, which it was back in the 80s, where you took 2 or 3 years to build a product. The question is, should it be built? And the question, should it be built, is based on one fundamental question only. Does anybody want this? Doesn't mean like 5 or 10 people. Does anybody want this in a profitably sustainable way? I.e., does anybody want it in such a manner that when you launch your product, the cost of running the company are less than what people are paying for it? Same thing as selling tomatoes, or selling carrots, or selling sweets, or selling anything else. The problem is that when we build technology startups with very bad habits, we go into a corner and we build our whole entire thing. And then we take it out to the world when we finished it. People are scared to start showing the world what they're thinking about and trying to learn from the world as they're developing their product. So this question of should it be built is the only question that a startup should be answering. Startup should not be answering any other question. Because until you establish whether or not your product should be built, you have no idea what you're really doing. You're like shooting in the dark. Right? And so there's a distinction here, and this is the main challenge, right? And this is another principle that you actually have to embrace. Most new business ideas are terrible. Most new business ideas are terrible. The startup failure rate pulled through to 5 years is 95%. That's how badly people are predicting what other people will pay money for. Randy Commissar and John Mullins wrote this book, Get Into Plan B, I think it's called. And in there they say that it takes 58 new products to get one successful one. So people are saying, they're in the shower, I'm going to make this foam that also writes and spray paints. And it sounds cool in your head. And you can imagine it in your head that it actually works. But does anybody want it? Is actually the really important question. And so, there's actually no value in your initial idea, except as a seed that forms the basis for you to learn. But what we do is because we went to business school and they're going to write a business plan and you have to stretch out your idea and do 5-year projections and all this stuff, right? We've started placing so much value on our initial ideas that we try and execute our initial ideas as they are. And that's the fundamental mistakes that most startups make. Great entrepreneurs are comfortable with killing their babies and pivoting to new ideas. And the best way to kill your baby, sneak up on them while they're sleeping. You must be able to walk away from your ideas and just leave them as they are. Most people assume that an established startup and a large company are the same thing. And they're actually not the same thing, they're different beasts altogether. Established companies are set up to execute validated business models. Startup companies are set up to discover sustainable business models. So one is a research project, the other one is an execution project. And what we have, right, one of the biggest symptoms that you're trying to emulate a big company is that there'll be like 3 of you, and one of you is the CEO, and the other one is the CFO, and the other one is the CFO. Like this, and I call this the curse of the O. Like, in a startup, those roles make, who are you CEOing? What are you CFOing? What are you Chief Operations Officer of in a startup with 3 people? It's just faking, right? And it's this traditions, it's all these traditions that we have is trying to emulate large companies that end up causing us problems. Steve Blank argues that startups are not smaller versions of big companies. And this book, the Startup Owner's Manual, is a really good book that I think people should actually buy. And I don't know that any of you know Rob Fitzpatrick and Salim Virani, they're like thought leaders in the startup community here. They have this phrase that startups are more like frogs rather than fish. And this is, they're trying to sort of metaphorically represent the connection between a small company and a big company. You see, when you see a small fish, it looks exactly like a big fish. So it's a big fish is just like a bigger version, like a blown-up version of a small fish. But a frog is not a blown-up version of a small frog. A small frog does not look like a big frog at all. They are physically different. So if a small frog, which is a tadpole, tried to do what a big frog does, it would fail. And so what startups need to embrace is that they're actually tadpoles. They're not frogs. Right? And that's the connection between being a startup and a frog. And Rob Fitzpatrick has this other concept which is really interesting, which is, he says when you're starting a company, it's like having a dartboard in the middle of the forest, and your friend walks you in there with yourself blindfolded, turns around 3 times and says, throw the dart at the dartboard, and you're still blindfolded. Now what we do is we just start throwing the darts. That's what startup founders do. You just start throwing darts. Did I hit it? No. Throw another dart. Did I hit it? No. And you know that that's like a dumb way to do it. The best way to do it is, how warm am I? Am I closer? No, more to the left, more to the right, down. Okay, now throw. Right. So if you think about the process of building a startup is that way, trying to find these directions of where you should be aiming your dart, then it changes your orientation altogether. You're now set up to discover whether or not the ideas that you have are actually good ideas before you invest any money in throwing them out. Another problem we have is startup advisors. And this is the curse of early success, right? You can't argue with success. Well, Seth Godin says, yes, you can. Because most people actually succeed despite of what they're doing. But there's an illusory correlation that makes people think that they succeeded because of what they were doing. And this is a very important thing to actually realize. A really controversial study was, I mean, this study took a long time to publish because people were really like angry at it. And the guy's question was, he's a professor at Surrey, and his question was, do entrepreneurs really learn or do they just claim they do? And what he did was he looked at over 6,000 startups from the Barclays Bank a database, and what he found was that there is no connection between previous startup success and future startup success. When you look at a venture, whether or not the person has been a successful company before has zero correlation with whether or not they're going to succeed in their next startup. Zero. And Rob has got so the conclusion is that no two startup situations are actually the same. And Rob has got this metaphor here that he also uses. See, when you talk to a startup founder, they'll tell you what you want to do to succeed is hop once, then do one big hop, and you've made it. And what they're basing that on is what they did in their startup. Meanwhile, this is your startup. So if you did one hop, and then did one big hop, you would fall through the cracks. Your job as a startup founder is to discover the topology of your own startup. No two startup situations are ever the same, even in the same marketplace. Even if you wanted to launch the next Facebook, you couldn't do what Facebook did and hope to succeed. That's what we call cargo cult behavior. You know about the cargo cult? And that's imitating visible behavior without understanding the underlying principles. And that's what happens when we struggle, we're trying to build companies. So in a sense, if you think about it, it's not like a research project or like a thesis or something like that, right? If you think about it that way, then it becomes a different orientation. Your job is not to execute your plan. Your job is to discover the truth about life. Your job is to discover exactly what it is that the marketplace will pay for. And so, once you actually think about that, you need to then start building a path for searching. So you take the smallest step. That's what the minimum thing is. The smallest step that you need to take to validate your hypotheses about the world. And this is the lean startup model, right? You start with your idea, you build the MVP, and then you measure, which is basically learning, and then you use that learning to change or pivot your idea. So you get out the building and start talking to customers as early as possible. In fact, build nothing. Just go out and find out if your problem hypothesis is correct. Startups succeed when they solve problems, right? So find out if what you're thinking is a problem is actually really a problem. Right? I'm writing a statistics book at the moment because I'm a research methodologist. And what we did was we just created a landing page that said, buy this book from Dr. Viki's Statistics Made Easy, whatever, for £5.99, click here to buy. Emailed it to 300 students. They clicked buy now. And then at the back it just says, sorry, the book doesn't exist. Well, we're interested in just measuring of the 300 people, how many would click on the link. That's all we care about. I want to validate this hypothesis I have in my head that people will actually buy the book. Now, don't be cargo cultish about it. Don't just build a landing page because that's the thing to do. Build whatever it is that is actually appropriate for testing the hypothesis you have about your customer. So, in the Lean Startup, we don't build products with the goal of selling. It's not pitching at all. It's actually, the goal is actually learning what the world is actually really like. It's the minimum product that we need to maximize learning. So the first thing that you actually need to have before you build anything is an explicit statement about the hypothesis that you're making about the world that you want to learn. Without that hypothesis, don't build an MVP. It's not an MVP. And then you need to be specific about the target market that you want to learn from. Right? You can't say everyone's not customer. And then the form in which it takes to achieve that learning, which is in the product that you're actually going to build. You need to specify who you're going to be talking to from the beginning. Be specific about who your market segment is. If you talk to anybody who will talk to you, then it's difficult to distinguish signal from noise. And if you've ever listened to startup co-founders arguing, I spoke to 10 people, and they said they like the product. Well, I spoke to 10 people, and they said they didn't like the product. Should we pivot? Should we not pivot? Okay, so who did you talk to? Well, I went to the nightclub round the corner, blah, blah. Who did you talk to? I went to the university. What? Who is your target market, right? And these are problems that startups actually face. And then you need to specify exactly what you would expect if your assumptions were correct. People will sign up to my landing page. It's not a falsifiable hypothesis. You have to say exactly what the conversion rate will be. And put it in big, bold, in your office. Raise it up there, 15% conversion rate. 15% of people will sign up. And you base it obviously on whatever back of the napkin mathematics you're doing about cost. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing whether you've learned anything. If you build your MVP, make it live, like Eric Ries says, to learn something about customers, you will learn, but you'll learn whatever happens, because you're not making any predictions. It's like a scientist walking into a lab going, I wonder what would happen if I took this blue one and mixed it together with a purple one. Right? There's no scientist that does that, right? They sort of set up the baseline hypothesis that they're going to do. And in science, this is the process we call operationalization, which is taking an abstract idea that you have about the market and making it concrete. And your MVP, the product, is the concretization of your assumptions about customers. It is a way of then testing these particular assumptions. And then you get out the building and start talking to customers. Don't worry, no one is going to steal your idea. Don't even worry about that. Like, there's a guy, Tristan Cromer, you will never meet a startup that makes him sign a non-disclosure, non-cookie, by the way, whatever. I won't meet you, because no one is going to steal your idea. But remember that there's very little value in the initial idea itself. It just forms this basis for learning. Thank you.